Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Allen. It took a year, but the Tokyo 2020 Olympics are officially underway, and this proves to be an Olympics like no other. With COVID restrictions casting its long shadow over the Games, Canadian athletes have not been idle. This year, Team Canada has sent 371 athletes to the Tokyo Olympics, which is the largest contingent sent to the Games since 1984 for the Summer Games in Los Angeles. But how prepared was Japan to host Team Canada or any other Olympic team? Just recently, Japan saw a spike in COVID cases and declared its fourth state of emergency. Tokyo banned spectators from all sporting events, stadiums, and Olympic venues. And Toyota, Japan's largest automotive manufacturer, announced it would be pulling TV ads from Japanese airwaves during the Olympics. So how are Japanese citizens reacting to the COVID-restricted Games? Should the Games have been delayed yet again, or have they soured on them completely? To help us understand Japan's response to Tokyo Games, I'm joined by Christian Howes, financial research manager, and Kit Nagamura, photojournalist and haiku poet, both guests living in Japan. Christian, and Kit, thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the show.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Excellent. So maybe I'll start with you, Christian. To give us some context, can you briefly talk about Japanese public health policy surrounding COVID?
Japan has been truly blessed in having a really different experience with COVID. And a lot of people have tried to explain reasons for it. Part of it is because it's an island country. Part of it is they managed to shut down the borders pretty quickly. But the public policy has started with basic behavior, wearing a mask, keeping social distancing, and being sensible, closing schools. And the real true lockdown experience was really limited to perhaps 3 or 4 months last year. For example, I was able to return to the office a couple of days of the week in July last year and have continued to do so. So although there is, quote unquote, the fourth state of emergency, it feels sort of like a state of urgency. In other words, people are careful, but not panicking. There's no restrictions in terms of movement around the city. But if you walk down the street without a mask, people are likely to look at you funny.
Okay, so would it be fair to say, Kit, that Japanese citizens take the COVID restrictions and measures quite seriously?
I think they take them very seriously. I think Japanese are super health conscious. They're aware of their own health, but the health of others as well. And even in years prior to COVID, visitors here would remark on the fact that during flu season, half of the people in the city of 14 million were wearing masks. And that was simply not to pass along the flu. So this transition into effective COVID measures was actually pretty simple for us to manage. And I think also the idea that you would cause harm to someone else by giving them an infection of some kind is a horror that most Japanese wouldn't want to face. So naturally, people are a lot more careful than I believe in other countries. Our spike numbers are so laughably low that friends of mine in Canada and the United States say, what's the worry, really?
Well, and you're a former Canadian, like you used to live in Canada, but for the last 30 years in Japan, but you're from the East Coast in Canada. So with speaking to Canada, how do you see the differences in how Japan has reacted with COVID versus how Canada has reacted? Kit.
I think that wearing a mask is something that we're very unfamiliar with doing. And it seems like an infringement on freedoms. So I think I've found people resistant to doing that. And I can understand it. It's not comfortable. And when it gets hot, you really don't want this thing on your face. But I also think that the fear of the unknown is large, and you can't really judge any country on how it reacts to COVID. There's too much that we don't know.
Yes, and when we keep hearing about these new variants, the Delta variant, all these variants that keep emerging, you know, will this vaccine have any mitigating factor on these variants? How does that look like? There is definitely, like you said, a lot of unknown and many variables here. We're going to continue this discussion, especially as we delve into the Tokyo Games in just a few moments when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the Tokyo Games and how they're happening. Maybe we'll just dial it back just a little bit. Christian, how were the games perceived amongst Japanese citizens? What is your sense of how the average citizen views the games?
The average citizen, I think, is feeling a tremendous letdown. 1964 was the last time Japan hosted the Olympics, and it was a coming out party, returning to the civilized society of nations, and so many wonderful things happened. They extended the subways, they got the bullet trains running, and they built overhead highways. It was new and different, and the first time that things were broadcast in color television. So 1964, particularly older folks in Japan, and there are a lot of older folks in Japan, really remember it super positively. And ever since we had the delay from last year, and then, of course, in recent weeks and months, the realization that people wouldn't be able to attend, it's felt like a letdown.
Right, and I can appreciate that.
It's been disappointing.
I can appreciate that.
Yeah, but I think the other issues, of course, around the stuff that you've heard lately about commercials and all of those things. It suddenly takes the discussion into the realm of both kind of economics and politics, which is, again, emotionally not where people want to go with something like this.
So, Kit, just continuing on this question, back in May, polling showed, and this is polling from New York Times, Bloomberg, Guardian, that 80%, more than 80%, opposed the games. Has public opinion shifted on either way, I suppose, in the last few months, Kit?
I would say that opposing the games is not quite the right way to put it. I think worried about the economic effects of the games is one thing that's top on people's minds. Where should that money have gone that would have helped more people otherwise? But Japanese are consummate hosts, but they want to do things perfectly. They are generally a nation of perfectionists. So they have a phrase in Japanese, omotenashi, which means really to dig to the bottom of your abilities and your purse to entertain and take care of guests. To not do it perfectly, to have to scale back on everything, to be confused and not prepared is not something that they want to have happen. So the fact that they can't do it perfectly and that it doesn't function as they expected it to has made people hesitant to support it.
Right, and especially when they have, again, much of the population have such a fond memory of the previous time that they hosted the Olympics. So then let's talk about the Toyota TV ad situation, if you will. Christian, what Kit just said, this desire to do things perfectly, do you think that is the impetus as to why Toyota decided to not only pull its ads from the Olympics, but actually even the CEO refuses to even attend the opening ceremonies?
I've been thinking a lot about this. And of course, the company itself is not specifically saying why they're doing it. I think there is a certain amount of concern about their interaction with the government on something like this. But I think it is fairly typical of management in Japan to try and be considerate of their employees. It's probably not just the CEO that would be showing up, but people, other senior members of the company with their spouses and so forth.
Right.
And not forcing them to go out into an environment where there is concern with people having arrived from overseas. So I think there's a genuine COVID angle to the behavior of the not attending the opening ceremonies.
Right.
And I think also there is a part of the discussion which probably works around the idea of a consumer company. After all, automobiles are consumer goods. And some other consumer goods companies have said they don't necessarily want to be as visible as they thought they did around a topic which is not 100% positively perceived by the population. So I think there's kind of two angles to it.
Because I think it's a good point. At any point during these games, there could be, let's say, you could say potentially a massive spike in COVID cases. And then if your brand is affiliated with that or associated, it could be a question of health, safety, and potential reputation damage, Christian?
Reputation damage, absolutely, both externally, from the point of view of frustrating or angering your consumers, and then also frustrating and angering your workforce. These people were forced to attend because the senior people were going, they had to go, they got sick. And that kind of taking care of your group, your team, is fairly typical of Japanese corporate behavior.
Okay, well, we're going to delve right back in just when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around. Welcome back. We're discussing the exciting Tokyo Games in the time of COVID, and who would have thought we would have a situation like this, but yet here we are. Kit, just before we went to commercial break, we were discussing Toyota's pulling of its advertisement and to some degree affiliation with these games. What are your thoughts on that matter?
I think that it's easily summed up by what the CEO mentioned. He said that this is a time for cooperation, not a time for competition. So I think the sense is that Toyota would like to see countries come together, not to compete for the fun of it, but to cooperate and help solve the issue that we're all facing.
Right. Let's change gears now when we talk about the game specifically. They're always this huge ordeal, many years in the making, many years anticipation from the local population. Obviously, a huge boost in tourism, even if it's just for a month or so. But perhaps puts the city like Tokyo on the world stage. How important, Kit, is tourism to the Japanese economy and the Japanese people?
Well, it's a trillion dollar business. It's extremely important. And it's one of the things that Japan has discovered could boost its economy in a significant way. It's a fabulous place to travel. It is one of the most amazing countries you will ever encounter. A lot of that stems from being isolated for 300 years. They developed a cultural level that's so extraordinary. So when people come, there's a lot to see, a lot to study, a lot to be amazed at. It's also safe, clean. It's a remarkable place. If you haven't been, Tanya, you've got to come. I'll take you around.
I love. My husband's been. I have not, but I would love to definitely go when I'm allowed to travel again.
Well, tourism was going hand in hand with the Olympics. Those two things going together seemed to make the price tag for the giant Olympic party worthwhile. Right. And now we wonder really what's going to happen.
Yes, and I think this is really what we need to talk about right now is the economic impact of the games. Obviously, no spectators equals no tickets sold equals loss of revenue. No spectators means no tourism revenue. As you said, that's a huge boost in their economy usually. How big of an impact do you think this will have on Japan's economy? We're going to talk about what investments they made, but what kind of impact will this have, these games, when we have no spectators, when we have no tourists? Christian, did you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. My team has calculated a number that is something less than half of 1% of a year's GDP. So the 2 weeks doesn't have a huge impact itself. But as Kit outlined, it is a focal point that has years of run-up and should have had immediate, long-lasting years of kind of run-down. And go back to when Tokyo won the Olympics. That was just after the Tohoku and Fukushima tsunami and nuclear problems.
Right.
And it was to put Japan back on a positive footing in a good direction is how this thing started. And it was a big win.
Right.
It was a really super emotional lift. So although they didn't have the new subways and that much that is different from the technology point of view, they did have an emotional resetting of the compass and a chance to invest and move forward that was very positive. And the other thing I would say is it did reset partially the relationship with China.
Okay.
China and Japan historically have had issues, and there's a couple of islands south of Japan that are still contested between China and Japan. And the rhetoric around them can be kind of comes and goes in waves. But in reality, once Tokyo became an Olympic city as opposed to just a Japanese city, I noticed the tone of the rhetoric changed. And boy, did the tourism from China ramp up, millions and millions additional every year, from something like 18 million tourists to well up over 25, 28
wow.
million.
I had
so the
no
numbers
idea.
are huge.
Wow.
Yeah. And that has stopped, obviously, during COVID.
And Kit, you noticed this swell of Chinese tourists as well?
Oh, absolutely. Chinese, Taiwanese, Philippines, from the Philippines, from Singapore, people poured in, people from India. I mean, we noticed such a boost that in 2019, as a guide, more or less, I worked every single day of the year.
My goodness.
And I was turning people away. So I think that will come back once we get COVID more or less under control, if we get enough vaccinations, if the vaccinations are effective. I'm afraid even if they're not effective, we're still going to see a wave of tourism come again.
Okay.
I'm already getting requests for the end of this year and next year. So I think we'll be okay. We'll be able to revive on that front anyway.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the Tokyo Games and how Japan will fare with these games and in general in the time of COVID. Kit, these games and no Olympic Games are cheap. You have years of building up infrastructure, building in stadiums. Sometimes it takes decades for a city to pay this off. The 1976 Olympics in Montreal, they were saddled with debt. It took 30 years for that city to pay it off. What's going to happen with Tokyo when we don't have the revenue from ticket sales and now it sounds like even sponsorships?
The price tag is about approximately $18 billion. So, but I don't think that anybody goes into the Olympics thinking these days that they're going to come out with a lot of money as a result. It's a giant party. You put out whatever you've got. You go into debt to make it a great party, and then you work 30 years down the pipe to pay for it. I don't think that. I think that not getting ticket sales is horrendous, and that's going to make it's going to take longer for us to recoup those losses. There's no question about that.
Do you have anything to add, Christian, to that?
Yes, I think the Montreal situation was a little bit different in terms of where Montreal was at that stage in the late 70s. And Tokyo, as we talked about previously, is benefiting from a renewed popularity, particularly from Asian and Chinese tourists. So if you think of how you could monetize something like an Olympic Stadium, for instance, people coming from China, if there were to be a massive concert by some wonderful artist who everyone wants to see, you could host them in that stadium and recoup a lot of your expenses. So I think it is a very different trajectory, although, as Kit points out, it's a big nut, and politically, people notice when you spend $18 billion.
Yes, they definitely do. They definitely do. So let's talk about Canada in the few minutes we have left before we have to unfortunately wrap. Let's talk about Canada's relationship with Japan. How was it pre-COVID? Did we have a good relationship in general?
Yes.
Yes.
Canada has had a fantastic relationship with Japan on many levels. Canada, I think, societally has so many things that they share with Japan. It's easy to maintain the relationship across the Pacific. Japan is also a big consumer of energy. Canada is a big producer of energy. Japan is a big consumer of food. Canada is a big producer of food. There's a lot of hand in glove stuff that really works well. And the flexibility on trade agreements and so forth has been something that Canada has been able to optimize as well.
And Kit, has the COVID situation or the Tokyo Games, have they impacted that relationship in any way?
That's a really good question. I grew up in the United States and Canada, so I have sort of a triple view of things. And I've noticed when I say that I spent part of my childhood in Canada, Japanese are thrilled. They love the idea of Canada, just so you know. They envision endless bounties of nature, kind people, a safe country, a balanced country. So I prefer to say I'm from Canada rather than from the rather than from the United States usually, because there's more of a competitive nature between the United States and Japan. I would say it's less love. But I don't know exactly how the games have affected that relationship. I'm not sure that I can point to any specific differences. I think that pretty much it's the same. Christian, what do you feel about that?
It is kind of the same. There's a few important crossing points in that the Canadians are recognized in some sports, and for instance, the first ever international rugby game for Japan was played against Canada.
Okay.
So when rugby is played here, as it was in 2019, and it will be played in the Sevens in the Olympics, that's always a special opportunity. And the evolution and promotion of women's sports in Canada has been pretty seamless, and that's something that Japan has been working to emulate and has been doing pretty well on. So Canada, has a lot of women that are perhaps doing better than the men this year.
Okay, last question.
That's exciting.
In the last few seconds we have left, will you be watching the games?
Oh, absolutely. I love sports. I wrote an entire book of haiku on sports. And people don't think of poetry and sports going hand in hand, but they do. And yes, I'll be watching everything I can get my eyes on.
Christian?
I would agree. It's still people competing at the highest level for their country, and it's very exciting. So we've paid a lot for it. We might as well enjoy it.
We're going to enjoy it. Well, thank you both so much, especially with the hour change, for joining me today. It's been thrilling.
Thank you very much.